Alright, this is the second multiple choice review. We'll start at question 22 where we left off. Question 22, at the end of the first multiple choice review video, we answered it kind of faking our way through. What they did was they'd been asking us questions about PPCs, and here's like the plotted points for a PPC for Mars and a PPC for Venus. And then out of nowhere they said, hey, what about comparative advantage? And when they started asking you about comparative advantage and who should specialize in what, the answer is always you should specialize in your comparative advantage good and trade. It is never, hey, don't trade. Okay? The answer is always specialize in your comparative advantage good and trade. And we also know that while it's possible to have a absolute advantage in both goods, absolute advantage just means you're better. It's possible to be better at both. That's the easiest question on the test if they ask that, by the way. Well, who has an absolute advantage? Just who's better. Comparative advantage is more complicated. It's the one they like to ask about. It is impossible to have a comparative advantage in both goods, mathematically. All right? One country always has to have a comparative advantage in one of the goods, and one of the country has to have a comparative advantage in other goods. They should specialize in that good and trade. You know you have a comparative advantage, by the way, when you have the lowest opportunity cost. Okay? And we just use those general ideas to kind of fake our way through this question. I've highlighted here the only combinations of goods that we need to think about, because when we think about comparative advantage and specialization on question 22, we don't care about these situations in the middle because these aren't specialization. They're not going to make these asterisk combos because the answer is always specialize, meaning only make one thing and don't make the other one. So 30 clothes and 0 foods, or 10 foods and 0 clothing for Mars. And these highlighted areas for Venus. Okay? And so, real quickly, a review of how we faked our way through this question. We knew some economics, but we didn't have to actually draw the opportunity cost boxes and figure it out. If you feel like you need to do that, that's fine. It's a good thing to know. It's likely to be a free response question where you have to do that. But if on a multiple choice, 1 out of 60 multiple choice questions where you have ultra limited time, you might want to think, I know how to do this, but I'm going to go back at the end because it's going to eat up so much of your time drawing those boxes, sorting out the fractions, unless you're just fast. Okay? I would save it for the end. Because some of them you can answer in 10 seconds, right? And those are worth just as much. So go to those. And then have some sort of marker to say, hey, go back to this one. Anyway, here's how we faked our way through it. Which of the concepts is correct which of these is correct based on comparative advantage? Okay? And I don't even think I have to look up there at the chart to answer this. Mars and Venus should continue producing the quantities indicated by the asterisks. No, those aren't specialization. The answer is always specialized. So it's not A, and I think we eliminated E by saying it says Mars has an absolute advantage in producing food. And if you look, yeah, I guess we do need to look at the chart. It's clear that Mars is not better at making food. Venus is. If Venus devotes all their resources to it, they get 20, and Mars only gets 10. Absolute advantage is easy. Who's better? Who's better at clothes, by the way? Venus with 40 or Mars with 30? Venus. Because these numbers are output numbers. It's how much you're making. All right, sometimes they're input numbers and things get a little bit weirder. But we know E is also wrong, so let's eliminate A and E, and now we can actually figure out what the answer is with B, C, and D, because here's the thing. Look at B. Let's say that this was right. Mars should specialize in the production of food. That means they have the low opportunity cost of food. They have a comparative advantage of food. That would mean Venus has to be clothes, right? Venus has to have a comparative advantage in clothes. Well, how come it can't be B and D then? Can't have 2 right answers. Boom, boom. Got to be C. And I think that's right. Let's actually work it out for real. I'm going to go over here and build an opportunity cost box, and we're going to work it out for real. Now, here's the thing. First thing I got to do is write the problem down. I'm about to write the problem down. I'm not drawing my opportunity cost box yet. Okay? In other words, this problem was presented in a weird way, and I want to write it down in a way that I can handle it. So, usually the way they present these problems is they say, okay, here's how much these countries can produce. And they say Mars and Venus, food and clothes, and say Mars, if they specialize, can produce 10 foods. I got that number from over there. And if they specialize in clothes, they can produce 30 clothes. The chart is from the test is not arranged like this, so I've got to rearrange it. I need to shrink it down so I have room for my opportunity cost box. This is not my opportunity cost box. I'm just writing down the problem in a way that I can deal with it. Venus is, if they specialize in food, is 20, and if they specialize in clothes, it's 40. Now, looks like Venus is better at both. If this is an output problem, and I think it is, these numbers from the problem represent how much they're outputting, how much they're making, how much they're producing. And you are better if you produce more than the other guy. Alright, so I think this is an output problem. You got to determine that first. You have to ask yourself, do these numbers mean how much we're outputting, how much we're making, producing? Sometimes they represent something like hours to produce one, in which case this would be 20 hours to produce one food. That's an input problem. How many hours go into making, or acres of land go into making it? Alright, or how many workers go into making it? In which case this person would be worse. They have to devote 20 hours when they only need 10. So it's not always just the high numbers. It would be the lowest numbers in input problems. This is an output problem. I like to say output starts with O for oh boy. It's an output problem, meaning it's got one step and it's easy. The one step is always who has comparative advantage, who has opportunity cost, who has a low opportunity cost. So we're going to draw a box to find opportunity cost. In fact, if this is free response, I want to label it opportunity cost so the grader knows what I'm doing here. And they'll be like, yes, good job. Put your countries on the side, your products on the top, just like over here. If it's arranged with the countries on top and the products on the side, you want to put them on the side, just move the numbers around, that's fine. Just always make sure that when you're comparing opportunity costs, you're comparing countries. You want to say to yourself, which country has a low opportunity cost? So I'm going to compare countries. Mars to Venus. So, how do you build an opportunity cost box? Don't put numbers in. Let the units be your guide. And ask yourself about opportunity cost. What is the opportunity cost of making a food? You give up clothes per food you make. The other unit always goes on top. What is the opportunity cost when Venus makes food? They give up clothes per food they make. What's the opportunity cost of making clothes? The other good always goes on top. So you give up food per clothes you make. For Venus, it's the same. They give up food for clothes they make. And now you just fill in the numbers based on our chart over here. Mars's food number is 10, and their clothes number is 30. Venus's food number is 20, and their clothes number is 40. Now you reduce these fractions. Let me grab another color. So 30 over 10 is 3, 40 over 20 is 2. Who has the lowest opportunity cost for food? Compare the countries. You want low opportunity cost. It looks like Venus. Venus should make food. Venus should specialize in food. Why? Because they have a comparative advantage. Why? Because they have a low opportunity cost. Look, grader. I found it. Alright? If Venus should make food, if Venus has a comparative advantage in food, who has to have the clothing? It's got to be Mars. I can confirm that. 1 over 3 is smaller than 1 over 2. Alright, I think that confirms our answer. We put C. Mars has a comparative advantage in clothes, I think is the answer. Alright, that's an output problem. I think there's an input problem later on the test. Or later on this review, if we get to one, we'll do an input problem. We'll skip all the rest of the output problems. You can work them yourself and see if the answer's right on the internet. Okay? Alright, let's get going. In Mars, if there's not an input problem, I'll work one at the end of the video. In Mars, we already did these. 20. Okay. Here's a table. Okay, this is. Let me see if this is an output problem. If so, I'm going to skip it. The table below shows the number of hours needed to produce 1 bushel of soybeans. Hours. So wait a minute. Are these outputs, or are these how much it goes into making it? These are inputs. This is how much goes into making one output. There's got to be an input problem. In which case you should go, this one's going to be kind of a pain. Maybe I can fake my way through it. I'm going to work it anyway, but let me see if I can fake my way through it before I work it. Alright, let's see. It's one of these 1, 2, 3, 4. These are good for faking. The United States has an absolute advantage in producing soybeans. Oh, that's pretty easy. Let's see. Who's better? Absolute advantage means better. You don't have to do any work to figure that out. Who's better making soybeans? United States makes one in 5 hours. Takes Japan 15. Is Japan better because it takes them 15 hours? Well, they're worse. Slower. All right. So I like 1. And let me pull all the answers up here because I want to cross out anything that doesn't have a 1 on it. Right? I want to cross out B. I want to cross out D. Okay. Japan has an absolute advantage in producing rice. Is Japan better at making rice? No, they're slower. It requires them more resources, more hours. So I don't like 2. And I'm going to cross out anything that has a 2 in it. I've already got this thing down to 2 choices without even having to draw a box. Holy crap. Japan has a comparative advantage in producing soybeans. I'd have to draw a box, an opportunity cost box to determine that. The United States should specialize in the production of soybeans, and Japan should specialize in the production of rice. Well, hold on now. Is 3 even on our radar as a possibility? 3 has to be wrong, because it's not one of our possible choices. We have to have a 1 in our answer, and we can't have 2. So 3 is not one of our new possible choices. Well, so 3 is wrong. Japan has a comparative advantage in soybeans. So what do they have a comparative advantage in? Rice. So Japan has to be rice. The United States has to be soybeans. Is that what this one says? The United States should specialize in soybeans? Japan specializes in rice? Yeah. So I like 1 and 4. I didn't have to draw a box. All right. What?
I was just wondering how you wrote out 3, but now it's...
Because 3 is not... I eliminated the ones I knew were wrong, and 3 wasn't on choice A or choice C.
Yeah, I see.
Okay, let's jump over here and work it for real. I'm going to work it very fast. You can go back and watch the video. This is an input problem. Okay? And just as a reminder, it is U.S., Japan. I'm not drawing the opportunity cost box right now. I'm just rewriting the problem over here. Alright? And it's soybeans and rice, 5, 15, 7, and 10. And this is input. Oh no. I don't like input. Because it requires 2 boxes. Alright? It requires 1 box where you flip all the fractions. Why do you draw a box where you flip all the fractions? I mean, what the heck do you label that box for the grader in case this is a free response? Well, you draw a box where you flip all the fractions because I don't know how to do input problems. I only know how to do output problems. And if I flip all the fractions, it becomes an output problem. Right now, it is actually technically, this is the number of hours per bushel or something. Bushel? Yeah. So it's input per output, right? Hours per bushel. Right now, it's input per output. So I always label this box to tell the grader what I'm doing here. Hey, I'm making and doing an output problem. I always label this box output. Or I label it out. Really, I label it output per input. Saying I'm just flipping. I'm flipping all the fractions. So 1/5, 1/15. Now this makes the numbers in our final box really weird. If you think you have a better way to do this, there probably is one. I mean, I do it a little bit faster way when I do it myself, but this one's so systematic, everybody can do it the same way and never fail. As long as you don't get bogged down by the craziness in the numbers here. Now I'm going to draw my opportunity cost box. You need it to be nice and big because the fractions are going to be weird. U.S., Japan. Tell the grader what this is. This is opportunity cost. And they'll be like, oh, I like this box. Put your units in, R over S. To make soybeans, you give up rice per soybean. To make rice, you give up soybeans per rice. You give up the other good over this good. Once the units are in, you're on your way. I'm going to draw a big fraction bar on each one because it's going to end up being fraction over fraction. Now that I've rearranged it from an input problem to an output problem, I'm only going to worry about the output problem. I don't need this anymore. I fix it so it's the way I like it. Alright? So what's the R number for the U.S.? 1/7. And the S number is 1/5. And so the S number is still 1/5 and 1/7 for the U.S. For Japan, their R number is 1/10 and 1/15 for S, 1/15 and 1/10. Now this is kind of why you need a lot of space, because reducing these fractions is weird. Basically, if this just said 7/5, you'd be like, oh, it's 7/5. But it's 1/7 over 1/5, so the numbers here just get flipped over. The fact that they're fractions makes the numbers get flipped over. We have, this one's really in the denominator, and this one's in the denominator of the denominator, so it goes to the numerator. Alright, so in other words, you just take the bottoms and flip them. So this is 5/7. What's this one? 15/10, right? You just kind of flip the numbers, the denominators. Okay, which one's smaller? This looks like it's bigger than 1, and this one's smaller than 1. You're going to have a calculator. You're going to have to be able to go, that's bigger than 1. That's less than 1. 5/7 of the pie is not a whole one. So that one looks smaller. Well, if U.S. has the soybean comparative advantage, Japan has to have the rice one. Let me confirm that. 7/5, I think that's bigger than 10/15. 10/15 is smaller than 1, 7/5 is bigger than 1. Alright, is that the answer? So we got United States should specialize in soybeans, Japan should specialize in rice? Absolutely. Alright. I think we're about to jump into some supply and demand questions. Alright, the first one starts out real easy. Almost unrealistically so. But it's a good place. It's a good place to start in the review, and then we'll jump into the real ones. Okay? If you got this problem on the AP test, you're out of your mind if you answer it without drawing the picture. Alright? If you just try to work it in your brain. You'll go slower, and you might get it wrong. Now, is it possible to draw the picture and figure out what happens if you can't label stuff? Price always goes here, quantity always goes here. Demand is downward sloping. Make it float, don't make it touch. Same with supply. Alright. And it says an increase in the demand for a good, so move demand to the right. A lot of people say, oh, I drew 2 curves, I better move them both. No. One change, move one curve. Supply doesn't move. Alright, that's ceteris paribus, right? We're only going to change one thing at a time. All other things are equal. Alright, so what happens to the price? My dotted line tells me, it used to be here, now it's here, it goes up. What happens to the quantity? My dotted line tells me it goes to the right. More price, more quantity, the answer is D. That one was really easy. But usually they won't just come out and say, hey, demand moves, supply moves. So usually they want you to know what does move the demand curve and what does move the supply curve. So let's go over to the other board while I adjust this and remind ourselves all the demand shifters and all the supply shifters. Okay? Start with the demand shifters. Now there's one thing on both that you got to remember. If the price of the good that we're concerned about changes, and it changes right now, it's not a shift. It's a movement along. Do you remember that? The price, if we're thinking about cars, the price of cars right now will not shift the demand or the supply. It will change quantity demanded, quantity supplied, and be a movement along. So be on the lookout for that trick. All right, that's more of an emphasis on the micro test, but it can show up in the macro test. Okay, so let's start out with what are the shifters of demand? One of them is not going to be the price of this good right now. All right, so what are the shifters of demand? You say demand shifters, and I remember them with this little NITER. These are all demand shifters. I do not memorize what does what because I just think about it, and you can figure it out. NITER, I'm sorry. Okay, NITER. N is number of buyers. Well, that's pretty easy. More buyers would demand more and shift demand to the right. Less buyers would demand less. I is income. That's usually pretty easy. If people's incomes are higher, they typically buy more of a good. If they're lower, they tend to buy less because they can't afford as much. However, we call those normal goods. There are special goods that we call them inferior goods, things like ramen noodles, where if you're richer, you tend to buy less. If your income goes down, you tend to buy more because you can afford it. All right, so you can afford that and not other stuff. So inferior goods work the opposite. Richer people buy less ramen noodles. Poor people buy more. All right, that's why, by the way, normal goods, you buy more if you're richer and less if you're poor, sometimes called superior goods. All right, so there's something weird about income, but they're called inferior goods. Taste is the easiest one. People want it more demand, want it less demand. Expectations, just rely on what you think a human would do. This is where you get tricked up, though. If your mind is thinking, okay, price is a move alonger, well, it's got to be the price right now. Expectations about price are just your feelings. If your feelings about future price change, then the demand curve shifts. And then, of course, what would a human do if they expected Dr. Pepper to be very expensive next week? What would they do now? Buy a lot, so they'll have a lot when the price goes up. What would a human do if they expected Dr. Pepper to be cheap next week? What would they do right now? They they wouldn't buy as much right now, so they say, well, I'll just buy it next week. All right. So notice I just thought my way through that. I didn't have anything memorized. When it comes to your own expectations about your own financial situation, your own income, that typically comes up sometimes too. What do people do when they expect their income to go up? They tend to buy more because they're relying on that future income. A little crazier with their spending. What do they do if they expect to get fired? Expect to get the boss to say, hey, you get a pay cut. They expect the economy not to do well. They typically buy less because they got to be careful. Okay, so they demand less. Related goods is the one the A/B test likes the most. This is either substitutes or complements. Remember, substitutes are goods that work together. I'm sorry, I said that exactly wrong. Substitutes are goods that substitute for each other, like Coke and Pepsi, pizza and hamburgers. And then complements are goods that work together. They complement each other, like peanut butter and jelly. I think that's the one they use on the screen. Okay? And when it comes to substitutes and complements, I don't memorize a thing. I think to myself, what would I do? What would I do if it's substitutes like Coke and Pepsi and I walked into the store and Coke was more expensive? Well, of course, that would just move along the Coke demand curve because that's the change in price of Coke. But I don't care about Coke. What about Pepsi? Coke is more expensive. I might buy more Pepsi. Coke's so expensive. So it would increase the demand for Pepsi. Notice, I'm describing a price. Okay? I'm saying, well, the price of Coke goes up. But I'm saying what happens to a related good Pepsi. And then it becomes a shift. All right? For a price to be a move alonger, to change quantity demanded and not demand itself, it has to be the change in the price of that exact good. It has to happen right now. So what would you do with complements like peanut butter and jelly? You walk into the store and peanut butter's cheap, but what would happen to your demand for jelly? It would go up flying because you would think, well, I can buy lots of peanut butter, so I'm going to demand lots of jelly to go with it, no matter what the price. Okay. Oh, and then how do you remember all the shifters of supply? Remember, price doesn't shift supply either. It moves along supply. It's a change in quantity supply. What are the actual changes of supply, though? What are the supply shifters? I only remember two things. All right? Number of sellers, just like the N from NITR. Number of sellers. More sellers is obviously more supply. Less sellers is obviously less supply. And then I remember, the other one is, I just asked myself, this seems to have to do with the guy running the business or the girl who owns a business. This has affected the business's ability to produce. And I asked myself, is this good for the business's ability to produce? That's what supply is. Or is this bad for the business's willingness and ability to produce? I just think, is this good for business or bad for business? So I just think, good for business. If it's good for business, they'll supply more. Supply will move to the right. If it's bad for business, supply will move to the left. No, let me throw one out. There's lots of them. High business taxes. Higher business taxes go up. Is that good for business? Of course not. So that's going to decrease supply. What about less government regulation? Do businesses like regulations from the government? Rules from the government? No. Or they don't like them, so less regulations is good for business. More supply. And if you think like that, it's easy. Two tricks here. Trick number one, quantity, price, supply, is suppose business taxes go down and you want to increase supply. Do I go up or down to increase supply? That's a trick. You go right to increase and left to decrease. It looks like it's going down, but that's going to be more. So quantity access more. The other trick is they'll do this. Alright? Really, when it boils down to it, there's four things you use to make things. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Right? If the cost of any of those goes up, it's bad for business. If the cost of any of those goes down, it's good for business. What's the cost of capital? I think it's the interest rate. Because we imagine businesses have to borrow money to buy capital. Well, the interest rate goes up, that's bad for business. You can't borrow as much and you can't buy as many new, pancake factories or whatever you make. If interest rate falls, businesses are able to invest more. That's good for businesses. Okay, so they're able to buy more pancake machines and supply more pancakes. The one that messes people up, though, is they'll say, what happens to supply with higher wages? And they know that students do this. Students go, ah, that sounds awesome. People getting paid more, and they just think that the world is just happy. And therefore, more supply of pancakes. Or computers or cars. And they get it wrong. Let me ask you this. If you own a business, say a baseball bat business, Do you like it when your wood's more expensive? That'd be land. That's a natural resource. Do you like it when that natural resource is more expensive? Of course not. That's bad for business. You can't afford to make as many baseball bats. Do you like it when your electricity is more expensive? No. Do you like it when your taxes are more expensive? No. Do you like it when the cost of your capital is more expensive? The machines that you use to make bats? No. Do you like it when your employees cost more to hire? No! So that would decrease supply. That's the number one trick with supply. By the way, that applies to aggregate supply as well. I wasn't just talking about aggregate supply or aggregate demand, but that little trick applies. Alright, so let's run through a bunch of demand and supply problems. The demand for a good or service decreases. Okay, it's just the opposite. Decrease in price, decrease in quantity. This one is C. Let's go to some real ones. Alright. A decrease in the price of silicon chips. Now, they don't leave it to you to know that computers are made out of silicon chips, so this is an input. And they don't leave it to you to know that people use computers and softwares together, so those are computers and softwares are complements, so this is a complement. They will actually tell you, oh, and by the way, just so you'll know, software is a complement. They'll tell you. This person who made the review does not. Holy cow, you can't see that in there. Sorry. I better move it down a little bit. Alright, so silicon chips are an input, and software is a complement. So, what happens? Well, this sounds like two different shifts. I might end up shifting both curves, because they gave me two different shifts. And so what happens? Here we have quantity, here we have price, and demand and supply. If I am going to shift both curves, I'm going to end up with two originals and two news. That's too many curves to deal with. So I'm going to draw my new ones in dotted lines so I can keep track of everything. And I also like to label my original equilibrium with just kind of a dot so I can keep track of what crosses matter. Alright, so silicon chips is an input, we said. Do businesses like it when their inputs are cheaper? Absolutely. So they will increase supply. I'm going to dotted line that guy. And do user-friendly software, that's a complement. That has to do with demand. Notice I have to make that decision before I move anything. Is it demand or supply? Increased production. That's just more. Wait a minute. Holy cow. Well, what does that do to the demand for computers if there's just more software out there? I better go figure out what that does to the cost of the software. And then we'll see if that let's see what happens. So I'll probably need to draw an additional quantity price for software, even though that's not, we're concerned about computers and the problem. Alright, I need to draw an additional demand and supply of software so I can see what happens to the price of the software, and there's more out there. They're producing more. Well, I guess that looks like it causes price to fall. So a cheaper complement, you're thinking, I guess if I could buy more software, I might need a computer to go with it. So that sounds like more demand for computers. And so here the lines cross, right? They started out crossing here and now they cross here. So it looks like quantity definitely increased. But price, it might have gone up a little bit. It might, if I sort of had drawn it drawn it differently, it might have stayed the same. It might have gone down a little bit. In other words, I don't know. So it looks like price may, we don't know, and then quantity definitely increased. So it's E. Okay. The increase in the price of peanut butter will cause the demand curve for jelly to shift. All right, these are definitely complements. Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. Sorry, I think this 27 is exactly the same as 26 though. All right, I think you get. Let's run through this real quickly. An improvement in the technology used to produce automobiles. That's good for business. But it says produce, so it's got to be supply. So that moves supply to the right, just like in the last one. An increase in the need for automobile transportation moves demand to the right, just like in the last one. So the answer is the same. We don't know what happens to price. Quantity increases. Sorry. So that one's C. Anyway, if an increase in the price of peanut butter, what happens to the demand curve for jelly? Well, I think they're complements. They might be substitutes. Some people might substitute them, but I think they're complements. And so if peanut butter is more expensive, people can't buy as much, and they're going to buy less jelly to go with it. So it'd shift jelly to the left if they're complements, and that's one of the answers. All right, D. All right, it would shift it to the right if they were substitutes, but that's not one of the answers. People would buy jelly instead. All right, according to theory of comparative advantage, you should make your low opportunity cost good. You should specialize in your low opportunity cost good, so that's B. An increase in the price of gasoline will most likely cause the demand curve for tires to change in which direction. So I don't know if they're substitutes or complements. It doesn't sound like they can substitute for each other. You can't jam a tire in your gas tank. But let's just assume they're complements, and if they're not, we'll figure out what to do if they're substitutes. If they're complements, expensive gas means people don't need as many tires because they can't drive as much. So they're going to demand less tires. It's going to shift demand to the left because they are complements. I think the answer is B. Let's go to 31. Remember, we're going all the way through section 2, so we've got to go fast. All the following might be expected to shift the demand curve for beef. All right? So they're saying, hey, here's a bunch of shifters of demand for beef. Which one's wrong? Which one's not a shifter? So they're either going to, the answer is either going to be some supply shifter, or it's going to be price. If price doesn't shift, it moves along, and I think A is price. Remember, it's got to be the price of beef. It's got to be the price of beef right now. That's what A says. All right, am I getting all this on the camera? I guess so. Let's go to 32. I don't like 32, so I'm gonna go real quickly over it. It's not a good question for a lot of reasons. The answer is all of them. You should just generally think that specialization in trade is always the answer. There's an ultra unique situation that AP test will not reference. If you both have exactly the same opportunity costs, your numbers are all exactly the same, then I guess you wouldn't benefit from trade. That's absurd. It's unrealistic. Of course, there's not trade when trade routes are cut off by wars. And then the only useful thing about this one is to remind you that tariffs, taxes on trade, can mess with the idea of comparative advantage. Can mess with the idea that we should always specialize in trade, because taxes add a cost to the equation that wasn't there before. And a tax on trade is called a tariff. All right, let's go to 33. It doesn't matter if they call them the Hatfields and McCoys. It's really two countries trading as far as I can tell. And they flat out give me the opportunity cost for the Hatfields right at the beginning. A unit of cloth is worth 0.8 units of corn. In other words, they could have one or the other. To build a unit of cloth, what do they got to give up? What's their opportunity cost? 0.8 corn. So there's their opportunity cost for corn. What's the McCoy's opportunity cost? I'm sorry, that's their opportunity cost for cloth. To make one cloth, they're going to give this up. What's the McCoy's opportunity cost for one cloth? 1.25. So who's got the lowest? Who should make the cloth? These guys only have to give up 0.8 corn, so they should make the cloth. That's the Hatfields. So Hatfields should make the cloth. It does tell you Hatfields, however, produce more corn and more cloth than the McCoys because they have higher quality resources. That means they have an absolute advantage of both. They're trying to trick me into think, oh, the Hatfields just make their own stuff. That's never the answer. That's one of the bad answers. All right. So let's run through the answers. Is there a basis for specialization in trade? Always. So it's not A. It's not B. I think C is the right answer. The Hatfields have a comparative advantage in cloth. Yep. And absolute advantage in cloth. They have an absolute advantage in both. D is wrong. The Hatfields enjoy a comparative advantage and absolute advantage in corn. No, it's the other way around. They do have an absolute advantage in corn, but not comparative. E is wrong because it says they have a comparative advantage in both, and that's impossible. Don't put answers that are impossible. All right, we're skipping the next two because I told you to. The last question is some lame. It's not a bad question. It's the idea of should you always do everything yourself? No, you should specialize in trade, even if you're good at everything. All right, let's go to the second section. Okay, the first couple of questions, I'm going to answer them by reviewing the circular flow chart. Oh, we've got about 15 minutes. We're doing good. Okay, remember the circular flow chart. I'm going to draw it the thing that students forget is they forget the names of the two major markets where businesses and households interact. What?
Did we just say 36 for this?
I said it's opportunity cost, specialized, comparative advantage. Alright, businesses? I guess I didn't answer it. Was comparative advantage one of the answers?
Yes.
And then households or consumers, businesses are sometimes called firms. Either way, they interact. And the easiest way they interact is to think businesses sell goods and services, but you can't see that big one. Move down. Businesses sell goods and services to the households, and households pay for them. And that's called the product market. So that interaction is that's where households buy products and services. It's called the product market. The one that students forget about sometimes is households actually sell something to businesses. What do households sell to the businesses? Their labor. Or if they own some land, they might rent that land. If they have some money in the bank, they might loan it to the business so the business can buy capital, charge them interest. Alright? So, in other words, households sell all the factors of production. So we call them factors of production. We call them inputs. We call them resources. They all mean the same thing. The stuff we use to make other stuff. What are the four factors of production? The four inputs, the four resources. Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. Those are all, we just imagine the economy, that all those are owned by households and sold to businesses. And then businesses have to pay for it. You need to know the payment associated with each. The thing that businesses pay for land is called rent. The thing that businesses pay for labor is called wages, or wages and salaries. The thing that businesses pay for capital, you think, well, they just go buy a machine. Well, we typically think they have to borrow money and they pay interest. And the thing that businesses pay for, oh, and by the way, we always assume they do. Don't ever. The answer is never. Oh, this company didn't have to borrow the money. They still have to give up the interest rate if they take it out of their own bank, their own bank account. And the thing that a business person pays him or herself for being an entrepreneur or not doing something else is called profit. All right. Let's go. Oh, and that's called the factor market. This interaction down here is called the factor market. Sometimes we also call it the resource market. You could call it the input market because factors, inputs, resources mean the same thing. You could put the government in here in the middle with both of them paying taxes. And then what do we get from the government? We get government services like national defense and highways and stuff. And then sometimes they just give us straight up money. If it comes to you from the government just because you're poor or you're old or some other reason, we call it a transfer payment. And then if it goes to a business from the government, just saying, hey, keep it up, business, keep making that cancer research or that corn, we call it subsidy. All right. Then sometimes we throw in the rest of the world on there for trade, and actually we end up with consumers, businesses, government, and imports and exports. So we have C, I, G, X, which make up GDP. All right, so let's answer some questions. This one says, what's the product market? Why, that is where businesses sell goods and services to households, so that's D. The next one says, what's the factor market? Or the resource market? They call it both. That was nice. That's where households sell resources to businesses or firms. Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. The next one says, how do we measure output in our economy? Now this is really up for debate. There are lots of ways to measure output in an economy, but only one of them is on this, A, B, C, D, or E. How do we measure output? GDP, gross domestic product. That's the final dollar value of all goods and services produced within our borders. Some people say the best measure is GNP. Remember, gross domestic product, domestic means at home within our borders. All the goods and services produced within our borders. National product is subtly different. That's means all the goods and services produced by our citizens, our nationals, no matter where they live, and our borders or not. All right. Anyway, that one's GDP. The AP test uses those interchangeably, GDP and output. They'll say, hey, what happened to output? They mean what happened to GDP. All right. Market value of all that's GDP. And then 5, which of the following people would be considered unemployed? I know this is a little out of order, but that's the way they made this. Let's jump over here and remind ourselves some things about unemployment. The first one's easy. It just says, hey, who's unemployed? To be unemployed, you have to have no job at all. Part-time job makes you employed, according to the statistics. According to the way they calculate the statistics. You just have a job that doesn't pay as much as you want, you still have a job, you're still employed. Alright? But remember there's 3 types, so let's review those real quick. We have structural. Start with the idea, I don't like to start with structural. Start with the idea that you're between jobs or you're just out of college and you haven't found the job yet, but the job is out there, you haven't found it, that's frictional. The transition from college to job or job to job is not smooth, there's friction, and that's when the job's out there. So we consider that inevitable, acceptable. Sometimes technology makes you have the wrong skills, or just for whatever reason you have the wrong skills. You know how to repair typewriters, you can't find a job, but there are jobs out there repairing computers. That's a situation where the structure of the economy is wrong for your skills. We call that structural. There's a subtype here called seasonal. Just, you're out of job because you're a lifeguard, it's winter. But they typically don't ask questions about seasonal, and it's so easy it doesn't matter. These 2 are considered inevitable and the result of good things, technology and people going to college. And so we consider these, we can't do anything about them, then they're not so bad. What's their total percent, typically? 3 to 5%. We call that the NRU, the natural rate of unemployment. Any extra unemployment, in theory, is because people aren't buying enough stuff for the job to exist. You want a job, but the factor is you're saying there's not enough demand. We would hire you if people were buying more of our stuff. Sorry. Or you're fired. People aren't buying as much of our stuff. Sorry, you got to go home. You're laid off. All right. What's that called? Because the economy is experiencing a downturn, a recession, and there's not enough demand. It's cyclical. It's based on the business cycle, a recession in the business cycle. Anything above the NRU has to be cyclical. That's the bad one. That's the one we try to fix with policy, if you're a Keynesian. All right? So, who is unemployed? If you quit your job... Now, remember, you're only unemployed if you are actively looking for a job, you want a new job. Does this person want a new job? No. Caring for their parents. Is this person who just quit to raise their children and then starts looking for a job again? Does this person have a job? No. Do they want one? Yes. They're unemployed. B's the answer. The person who quits their job to go back to school doesn't want one. The person who is qualified to teach but is driving a bus has a job. And this person has a part-time job, wants a full-time job. Sometimes people aren't satisfied with the nature of their job. That's why we also say that unemployment statistics often make the story look better than it actually is. Because it considers people that do have a job they don't like fully employed. Okay? So unemployment understates the problem a little bit. Because some people have a part-time job and want a full-time job. Or they have a job that underpays them for their skills. Okay? Back to gross domestic product. Remember, there's 2 ways to calculate gross domestic product. We can say, well, what's all this? How much stuff was bought? All that gross domestic product is how much we produced this year. If we bought it, it had to have been produced, and then we make a bunch of adjustments for the fact that some stuff was produced last year, etc. But the easiest way, the one that you should know by heart, is to add up all the spending, add up all the demand, add up all the buying. What are the 4 types of buying? Consumer spending, business spending on capital called investment, so gross private domestic investment, government spending, and foreign spending on our goods, but it's net exports because it's technically exports minus imports. More on that in a second. Which of those is the biggest? It's the one that has to do with people, Americans, and that is be consumers. See. Now the other way to add up GDP is to add up. If you add up all the spending, you could also add up all the receiving of that money as income. And the way you get income is you provide a resource. So what's all the incomes from resources? The 4 resources are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So all the incomes from them are rent, wages, interest, and profits. Which one of those? And then you have to make a bunch of adjustments. But typically, this actually adds up to national income, and you make a bunch of adjustments. You don't have to do those in an AP test. Typically, we make enough assumptions that these actually do add up to GDP. What is the biggest one of those? It's the one that most people do. Most people have a job that pays wages. Okay, so that's the biggest one of those. That's the answer to number 7. Now, what of that national income accounting stuff that was so hard to remember do you have to know? You have to know these 2 facts, and then you have to know this one. How to go from gross to net. Alright? Remember, gross is big, and so big it's disgusting. It's gross. Alright? It's big. Net is small. Something has been subtracted out. So to go from gross to net, from big to small, you subtract. What do you subtract? Depreciation. Sometimes they call it capital consumption allowance. It's machines being used up and they have to be replaced. You subtract depreciation. How do you go from net to gross? Small to big. You add depreciation. Alright? Zinc. Alright, let's see. Let's go to 7. Oh, wait, we just did that one. 8. Alright, so what doesn't count in GDP? Well, it's got to be produced this year. It's got to be new. So used goods don't count. It's got to be some sort of spending, some sort of dollars that went to something that's produced. If I just give a gift, nothing is produced. If the government just gives me free money for being poor or old or whatever, it's a gift. We call it a transfer payment because they're transferring money from taxpayers to some other person. But nothing is produced. Transfer payments don't count. Is anything produced when you buy a stock or a bond? No. Stocks and bond purchases don't count. Black market purchases the government doesn't know about, so they don't count. Or the people who add these numbers up don't know about them, so they don't count. If I buy some, a bunch of cocaine, we don't report that to the government, so it doesn't count in GDP. All right? If I do, services count because you get paid for them. If you're a barber, you get paid. But if you do it for your own family and there's no money changing hands, it doesn't get counted. Maybe it should, but it doesn't. Okay? So let's see. Does a used textbook count? No! Only stuff produced this year. It already always counted some previous year. New, I like that. Harvesting equipment for a farm. Yes, would that be C, I, G, or X? This machine for this farm business. I, that one counts. Stock doesn't count. Cars produced in a foreign country counted their GDP. And by the way, suppose I bought this car for $20,000. What would that do to our GDP? Would that help our GDP? Of course not. We didn't produce it. What would it actually do, though, if you zoom in there on net exports? If I buy a car from a foreign country, it's an import, right? It actually gets subtracted. Here's exports, here's imports, and those together make net exports. All right? What about government bonds? No, it's a bond. It doesn't count. It's a piece of paper. Nothing's produced. No, it doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it doesn't help GDP. All right, I'm going to try to get through 10. Which of the following would be included in calculation of gross domestic product? Oh, I like this. Government buys a new submarine. Yeah! That would be G, by the way. It's new. Government bought it. Social Security payments, that's a transfer. It doesn't count. Nothing's produced. Purchase a home built 10 years ago. That's used. What about a new home? That would count. Does that count as consumption because it's a household? Remember, all construction counts as business spending. As gross private domestic investment is I, because it could be rented out as a business. All right? Contribution to your charity is a gift. If you cut your own kid's hair, no money changes hands, so we don't know about it. And I think I just answered 10, by the way. Which of these is investment? The purchase of a used computer, sorry, because that was used. Stocks don't count. New houses count as investment. Roads by the government would count as G, and then the profit earned when selling shares of stock doesn't count at all. So the only one on there that's investment is, because they didn't ask about GDP on this one, they asked about specifically investment, and that would be the new house. So that one is C. We're not really getting behind, and we'll pick up here on the next review this afternoon. We'll actually catch up when we get to Unit 4 because it's so short. All right. Bye-bye, everybody. Where are we at? Question 10, Unit 2. Start on 11, next review.